In October of 1994, a German archaeologist walked up a barren hill in southeastern Turkey, near the city of Şanlıurfa, and within a few minutes he understood that the history books were wrong. His name was Klaus Schmidt. He had spent years digging at another ancient site nearby, and he knew what a Stone Age workstone looked like when he saw one. So when he found broken slabs of carved limestone poking out of the dirt on top of that hill, slabs that an earlier survey had brushed off as medieval grave markers, he did not see graves. He saw the tops of buried pillars, enormous ones. He later said that only a human hand could have shaped something like this, and that it was clear right away he was standing on a gigantic site from the Stone Age. What he could not have known yet was how old, not centuries, not a few thousand years. The stones under his feet had been carved and raised by people roughly 11,500 years ago. That is older than the first cities, older than the first farms, older than pottery, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than bronze. It is about 6,000 years older than Stonehenge, and roughly 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. And here is the part that kept Schmidt awake at night, and that has unsettled archaeology ever since. The people who built this place were hunter-gatherers. They had no farming, no metal, no livestock, no villages of the kind we picture when we say civilization. By every rule scholars had written down for a century, these were not the kind of people who built monuments. Monuments were supposed to come later, after the farms, after the surplus, after the kings. Yet here was the monument, sitting in the ground, thousands of years too early. So who built Göbekli Tepe, and how, and above all, why? That is the question this hill has been asking us for 30 years. The answer is forcing us to rethink the order of everything we thought we knew about how human beings became civilized in the first place. To understand why this site landed like a small earthquake in the world of archaeology, you have to understand the story we used to tell ourselves about the dawn of civilization. For most of the 20th century, the model went like this. First came farming. Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, in the arc of land we call the Fertile Crescent, people slowly stopped chasing wild game and gathering wild plants, and started planting seeds and herding animals. Farming produced extra food. Extra food let people stay in one place, build permanent homes, and have more children. Settled life produced surplus, and surplus produced everything else. Specialists who did not have to hunt. Priests, leaders, trade, and eventually, with all that wealth and free time, people built temples and cities and the first complicated religions. It was a clean story, and it made sense. Civilization was a ladder, and farming was the first rung. You could not have organized religion and giant stone monuments before you had agriculture, because somebody had to feed the workers. The temple was the reward at the top of the climb, not the thing that started it. Göbekli Tepe took that ladder and turned it upside down. The site sits on the highest point of a long mountain ridge, about 900 feet above the plain below. In the Stone Age, the land around it was not the dry, dusty country you see today. Schmidt described it as something close to paradise. Herds of gazelle moving across open grassland, rivers, stands of fruit and nut trees, and rolling fields of wild grain, wild barley, and wild forms of wheat, called emmer and einkorn, growing on their own with no one to plant them. It was one of the richest wild larders on earth, and the people who lived there did not need to farm to eat well. The name Göbekli Tepe is Turkish. It means, roughly, potbelly hill, because of the rounded mound shape the ridge had taken on. For centuries, local farmers had plowed the top of that mound. They had hit hard stone with their tools and cursed it and worked around it. A survey team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University had actually visited the spot back in 1963, noted the broken limestone slabs, and moved on. One researcher guessed they were grave markers from some later period. Nobody dug. Nobody guessed what was sleeping a few feet down. It took 30 years, and one archaeologist who had trained his eye on exactly this kind of stone to come back and look again. When Schmidt began excavating in 1995, the ground gave up something that did not match anything in the textbooks. Just below the surface, he found circles, great oval and round enclosures, ringed by stone walls and benches, and standing inside each ring, a series of massive stone pillars, not rough boulders, carefully shaped, smoothed pillars in the shape of the letter T, a tall vertical shaft topped by a wide, flat crosspiece, like the head sitting on the shoulders of a faceless giant. The biggest of them stand around 18 feet tall, and some weigh on the order of 10 tons. At the quarry nearby, archaeologists found one pillar that was started and never finished, lying in the bedrock. Had it been raised, it would have stood about 22 feet and weighed something like 50 tons. In the center of each main circle stood two of the tallest pillars, facing each other, set apart from the ring around them. And the longer Schmidt looked at these central pillars, the clearer it became that they were not just abstract slabs. They were people, or rather, beings. On a few of them you can see arms carved in low relief running down the sides of the shaft, bending at the elbow, with long fingered hands brought around to meet at the front, as if folded over a belly. One of them wears a carved belt and what looks like the pelt of a fox hanging from it like a loincloth. The flat top is the head. These are stylized human figures, 3 or 4 times life size, standing in a ring, facing inward, frozen in some gathering we will never be invited to. And they are not alone. The pillars crawl with animals. Snakes pour down the stone in tangled knots. Foxes leap. Wild boar bare their tusks. There are gazelle, wild donkeys, aurochs, which were the huge wild cattle of the ancient world, cranes and ducks, and other long-necked birds, scorpions with their tails raised, and again, vultures. The carving is not crude. These are confident, observant images of the real animals those people lived alongside and hunted and feared. Whoever made them had looked very hard at the living thing before they put it in stone. The most famous single stone at the site is known as Pillar 43. In the enclosure, archaeologists labeled D. People call it the vulture stone. It is densely packed with figures: a great bird with outstretched wings, a scorpion, a snake, other creatures, and near the bottom, a small, headless human figure. It is one of the most studied and most argued over carvings in all of prehistory, and we will come back to it, because it is also where the line between careful science and wishful fantasy gets drawn. Now, building any of this would be hard with modern tools. Picture doing it without metal. The limestone was cut from a plateau a few hundred yards away using stone tools because there was no metal of any kind. The pillars were shaped, then dragged up the ridge and stood upright in prepared sockets, then carved with their animals and their arms and their belts. Schmidt estimated that moving a single one of the big stones would have taken hundreds of people pulling together. He pointed to the experiments people have done with the great stone heads of Easter Island as a rough guide for how many hands it takes to move tonnage with rope, muscle, and patience. Hundreds of people. That is the number that breaks the old story, because hundreds of hunter-gatherers do not normally gather in one spot. Foraging bands are small. They have to be, because wild food is spread thin, and a big crowd in one place strips the land bare fast. To pull hundreds of people together, feed them, and keep them working on a project that took not weeks but generations, you need something powerful enough to override the basic math of the hunting life. You need a reason, a shared belief, something worth leaving your territory and breaking your back for. That is the heart of what Schmidt was looking at. Not just stones, evidence of organization, cooperation, and shared belief on a scale nobody thought possible before farming. Then the dates came back, and the puzzle got sharper. Archaeologists do not guess at ages like this. They use radiocarbon dating on organic material found in the layers, charcoal, bone, the residue of old life, and they read the chemistry of the soil and the styles of the stone tools. The results place the oldest excavated enclosures in a period that specialists call the pre-pottery Neolithic A. In plain terms, the earliest big structures at Göbekli Tepe were built somewhere around 9,500 years before the Common Era. The site stayed in use, with new building and rebuilding for roughly 1,500 years after that, into a later phase called the pre-pottery Neolithic B, before it was finally abandoned. Pre-pottery is exactly what it sounds like. These people had not invented ceramics yet. They had no pots. The wheel was thousands of years in the future. Writing would not appear for another 6,000 years or so. And crucially, when scientists looked at the plant and animal remains from the early layers, they found no sign of domesticated crops or domesticated livestock. The grain they ate was wild. The animals on their menu, gazelle and wild pig and deer and waterfowl, were hunted, not herded. By the test that defines the line between forager and farmer, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were foragers. Take a moment with what that means. A people with no farms, no permanent towns of brick, no writing to pass on plans, no metal to shape stone, no draft animals to haul weight, somehow organized themselves across many generations to quarry, carve, raise, and decorate 10-ton pillars in carefully arranged rings on top of a mountain. And they did it first, before the farm, before the city, before almost everything we file under the word civilization. So Schmidt asked the obvious, dangerous question: what if we have the order backward? His idea, stated simply, was this. First came the temple, then the city. He suspected that places like Göbekli Tepe came before agriculture, not after it. That the powerful pull was not a full belly, but a shared belief, a reason to gather, to feast, to build, to mark a sacred spot, and that the act of gathering itself, of bringing hundreds of people to the same hill again and again, year after year, might have been the thing that pushed those people toward farming in the first place. Think it through. If you need to feed a crowd of workers and worshippers who keep returning to one place, wild grain alone will not stretch far enough. You start managing the wild stands. You start saving the best seed, clearing competing plants, maybe planting near the gathering ground, so there is food on hand when the people come. Over centuries, that tending could slide, almost without anyone deciding it, into true farming. In that telling, religion did not arrive as a luxury after farming made life easy. Religion, or at least the human hunger to gather and build something larger than the band, may have been one of the engines that drove farming into existence. There is a haunting piece of evidence sitting right next door that fits this story almost too neatly. In the late 1990s, a team of geneticists went looking for the birthplace of cultivated wheat. They gathered samples of wild einkorn from all across the Fertile Crescent and fingerprinted the DNA to find which wild population was the closest living relative of the wheat that farmers eventually grew. The trail led to one place. The wild einkorn that matched domesticated wheat most closely was growing on the slopes of a mountain called Karaka Dağ. That mountain is in the same region as Göbekli Tepe, only a short distance away. The wheat that would one day feed the first cities of the world was first tamed in almost the same patch of land where these hunter-gatherers were raising their stone giants. That is a stunning coincidence, if it is a coincidence at all. The place where monumental religion may have begun and the place where wheat was first domesticated are practically neighbors. It is exactly what you would expect to find if Schmidt was right, if the gathering came first and the farming followed. Now, this is the moment to be honest, because honesty is what separates history from fairy tales. Schmidt's idea is bold, and it is influential, but it is not settled fact, and the more we dig, the more complicated it gets. Schmidt believed Göbekli Tepe was a pure sanctuary, a place people came to for ritual and feasting and then left, not a place where anyone actually lived. He argued, among other things, that nobody could have lived on that hilltop because there was no water source up there. That picture of a lonely temple on a hill visited by wandering bands is the version that spread around the world. But Schmidt died in 2014, suddenly, while the work was nowhere near finished. As of the early 2020s, only around a tenth of the site has been excavated. Under the leadership of Turkish archaeologists who took over the project, newer digging has started to complicate his clean separation between temple and town. For one thing, the hilltop turns out to be covered not only with the grand enclosures, but with smaller, more ordinary buildings. Excavators have recovered thousands of grinding stones and tools for processing cereal, the gear of everyday food preparation. Most strikingly, they have found rock-cut channels and large carved cisterns capable of holding many cubic meters of water, which speaks directly against Schmidt's claim that the hill was too dry to live on. The emerging picture is messier and, in a way, more human. It looks less like a cathedral standing alone in the wilderness, and more like a place where the sacred and the daily lived side by side, ritual and domestic life under the same sky. Some archaeologists have pushed back even harder on the original idea. The most pointed challenge concerns the very thing that made the site famous: the great enclosures. The Canadian archaeologist Edward Banning has argued that the big T-pillar buildings may not have been roofless open-air temples at all, but roofed structures that people used and even lived in, decorated houses rather than dedicated shrines. In that reading, the sharp line between temple and home, the line that made the whole story so dramatic, starts to blur. The monumental and the ordinary may not have been separate worlds at all. So even the basic label, the world's first temple, is under live debate. It may be a temple. It may be a kind of grand communal house. It may be something we do not have a clean word for, because nothing quite like it has survived from anywhere else this early. What is not in doubt is the age, the scale, the skill, and the fact that hunter-gatherers made it. Those facts hold no matter which interpretation wins. There is one more genuine mystery here, and it is one of the strangest features of the whole site. The people who built these enclosures, at the end of their use, appear to have deliberately buried them. The great circles were not simply abandoned to fall apart and wash over with dirt by accident. The early excavators found them packed full, deliberately filled in with rubble, broken stone, animal bones, and debris, as if the builders had gone to enormous trouble to entomb their own monuments. New circles were sometimes raised on top of the old, buried ones. Over centuries, the repeated burying and rebuilding is part of what gave the hill its swollen, pot-belly shape in the first place. The mound is, in a sense, made of buried temples stacked on buried temples. Why would anyone bury something they spent generations building? We do not know. Schmidt and his colleagues suspected it was intentional, a ritual closing, the deliberate retirement of a sacred space when its time was done. There may have been a belief that a place could be used up, that its power had to be sealed away when one cycle ended and another began. Other researchers are more cautious. They point out that hilltop sites slide and slump over time, that debris washes downslope and accumulates, and that what looks like a careful burial might be partly the slow work of erosion, collapse, and people scavenging old stone to build new things. The truth is probably somewhere in the argument between those positions, and we may never pin it down with certainty, but the image is unforgettable. People who buried their own cathedrals on purpose, by hand, and walked away. For a long time, the easiest objection to all of this was that Göbekli Tepe might just be a freak, a one-off, a single weird site that, however old it was, told us nothing general about the human story. If it stood alone, you could shrug it off as an exception. It does not stand alone, not anymore. In the hills around Şanlıurfa, Archaeologists have now found a whole family of related sites from the same deep era, and the work of uncovering them is one of the most exciting things happening in archaeology today. The Turkish government and its scholars gathered this effort under a project name Taş Tepeler, which means the stone hills or stone mounds. It covers a string of Neolithic settlements scattered across the region, sites with names like Sayburç, Sefer Tepe, Çakmak Tepe, and others, each adding pieces to the puzzle. The most important of these, after Göbekli Tepe itself, is a site called Karahan Tepe, a short distance away. Karahan Tepe is staggering in its own right. Excavators there have identified hundreds of T-shaped pillars, in the same family as Göbekli Tepe's. They have uncovered a remarkable chamber cut partly into the bedrock, a kind of pillar shrine with a ring of standing T-pillars surrounding figures carved straight out of the living rock. They have found a tall, lifelike human statue, more than 7 feet of carved stone, and the figure of a vulture, echoing the same animals that haunt Göbekli Tepe. There is even evidence at the site of people gathering to cook and share food together, some of the earliest hints anywhere of communal dining. What Karahan Tepe and the other stone hills prove is that Göbekli Tepe was not a miracle that happened once. It was the most spectacular surviving example of a whole tradition, a culture, spread across this corner of the world more than 11,000 years ago, that carved giant stone beings and gathered to raise them. The builders had neighbors, relatives, rivals, a shared way of seeing the world that left its mark on hill after hill. That changes the question. It is no longer just who built this one strange place. It is what kind of world produced an entire society of monument builders before farming, and how much of it is still buried, waiting. Now, a site this dramatic and this old attracts more than archaeologists. It attracts people who want it to mean something far bigger and far stranger, and this is where we have to be careful, because the most exciting sounding answers are usually the ones with the least evidence. You will find claims, in books and across the internet, that Göbekli Tepe is proof of a lost advanced civilization, that hunter-gatherers simply could not have made it, so it must have been built by some forgotten high culture, wiped out by a catastrophe, or that it encodes secret astronomical knowledge from a vanished golden age. These ideas are seductive. They are also, by the standards of actual evidence, not supported. The most famous version centers on that carving we met earlier, the vulture stone, Pillar 43. In 2017, 2 researchers from the University of Edinburgh, an engineer named Martin Sweatman, and a colleague, published a paper arguing that the animals on Pillar 43 are not animals at all, but a star map. They proposed that the carving records a specific catastrophe, a comet or fragments of a comet striking the Earth around 11,000 years ago, an event some scientists link to a sudden cold snap in the climate called the Younger Dryas. In their reading, the headless man on the stone stands for human deaths in the disaster, and the whole pillar is a date stamp, a memorial carved into rock to mark the worst day in history. It is a gripping story. It is also one the archaeologists who actually dig the site reject, and their reasons are worth hearing, because they show how this kind of careful thinking works. Jens Notroff, a researcher long involved with Göbekli Tepe, and his colleagues laid out the problems. To begin with, the idea rests on lining up arbitrary clusters of animals with modern constellations, and our constellations are not natural groupings written into the sky. They are cultural patterns, drawn differently by different peoples, and there is no good reason to think a Stone Age culture saw a scorpion or a vulture in the same handful of stars we do, let alone that the pattern would stay fixed across 10,000 years. The theory also picks out a few figures from the stone that fit the comet idea and quietly ignores the many that do not. And then there is that headless man, supposedly a symbol of mass death. Notroff pointed out, dryly, that the figure also has an erect phallus, which is a strange thing to put on a monument, to catastrophe and slaughter. Carvings of this kind, with headless figures and birds, appear across the region and are far better explained by the death and burial customs of these people, by ideas about the body, the ancestors, and the spirits, than by an astronomical disaster. The underlying comet impact idea itself, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, remains contested among scientists for its own separate reasons, and tying it to a single Stone Age carving only stacks one uncertain claim on top of another. So here is the honest verdict, the thing this hill does and does not overturn. Göbekli Tepe does not prove a lost super-civilization, or visitors from the stars, or a secret astronomy that modern science forgot. There is no evidence for any of that, and the people who invoke it are usually reaching past what the stones can support. The builders were not a vanished master race. They were us, ordinary, brilliant, fully human hunter-gatherers, working with stone tools and rope and an enormous amount of cooperation and belief. What Göbekli Tepe does overturn is the order of the story. It shows, beyond serious doubt, that large-scale cooperation, monumental building, sophisticated art, and what looks a great deal like organized religion did not have to wait for farming, surplus, cities, and kings. People who still lived by the hunt could pull hundreds of their own kind together, sustain a shared project across many lifetimes, and raise some of the most ambitious structures of the ancient world. The capacity for civilization, the social and spiritual machinery of it, was already running inside the foraging band, thousands of years before the first field was sown. That is the revolution sitting in the dirt of a hill in southeastern Turkey. Not a lost world, but a missing first chapter to our own. The world recognized it. In 2018, Göbekli Tepe was added to the list of UNESCO World Heritage Sites, named as one of the first great works of monumental architecture ever made by human hands. After thousands of years buried in a mound that local farmers cursed and plowed around, the stone giants stand in the open air again, ringed now by a modern shelter, looked at by visitors from all over the planet who come to stand where the old story breaks. There is something worth carrying away from that hilltop. We like to imagine that we became civilized by accident, that comfort and full bellies came first and gave us the room to dream up gods and art and great works. Göbekli Tepe whispers the opposite, that the dreaming may have come first, that before we had cities to protect or wealth to display, before we had writing or metal or even bread, we had the urge to gather, to mark a sacred place, to make something beautiful and enormous together, and to believe it mattered enough to break our backs over. That urge, it turns out, may be one of the oldest and most human things about us. Older than the farm, older than the wheel, maybe the very thing that started us down the road to everything that came after. The hunter-gatherers who built it left no names and no writing, and we will never hear their voices. But they left their giants standing in a circle, faces turned inward towards something we can no longer see, and across 11,500 years, that is still enough to stop you cold. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the kind that quietly rewrite what you thought you knew, subscribe and stay with us.